Films and works of architecture are art forms that share many similarities. At their best, they are original, complex creations that draw on many disciplines that are crafts in their own right. Architecture tries to make our life experiences better, whilst movies, on the other hand, focus rather on a shorter period of time, but are no less interested in elevating the human experience. Whilst architecture deals with the manipulation of space and the physical, film uses time and the intangible as its devices. Both architecture and film share commonalities in underlying structure and expression. I thought it would be interesting to find a film and a piece of architecture that were the emotional, intellectual and spiritual twin of the other. In this way, I can show the connection between film and architecture, as well as the connection between the director and the architect. And by doing so, hopefully I'll show the conceptual and structural similarities that film shares with architecture. In this video, I will show why I believe Once Upon a Time in Hollywood has an architectural equivalent in Rem Koolhaas's iconic Seattle Public Library. We need to understand why Once Upon a Time in Hollywood has taken its place in movie-making history. To start with, it is made by one of the most famous living directors with a highly acclaimed body of work behind him. Tarantino is well known for studying past film works and then copying entire scenes quite openly whilst putting his own spin on them. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is an immersion into another world. It takes a well-known, tragic story of Sharon Tate and puts an alternate spin on history. It also has the characteristic DNA of a Tarantino movie. As with all his movies, he has remained true to the original, celluloid, authentic art of movie making. Tarantino took great care in recreating every aspect of the time and place of LA. Each of the 32 scenes is crafted with care, each almost a little mini-movie that plays its own special part in the overall narrative. So why have I chosen the Seattle Library to be the architectural version of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? In order to understand this, we need to understand what makes the library so iconic and so special. The Seattle Library was designed by Rem Koolhaas, one of the greatest living and practicing architects. He too is such a well-known and accomplished architect with a respected body of work that his works are inseparable from his identity and his status. Rem Koolhaas is also one of the great thinkers in architecture. The Seattle Library now is a new take on an old typology of the traditional library. The library shares the DNA of Rem's approach to architecture, focusing on program, space and form and its place in the urban context. Tarantino studies films, both past and present. So too does Rem Koolhaas remain a student of architecture. Tarantino looks to past works for inspiration, often reinventing, reinterpreting and stylizing already filmed scenes. His way of working has been well documented and fuels the eternal question, is there truly original creative thought? Rem Koolhaas, on the other hand, analyzes the history of architecture to inform completely new ways of thinking. References to the past are untraceable in his aesthetic. Although aesthetics are not the primary concern of his often very theoretical and intellectual approach. I believe architecture and film to be similar. We can therefore apply similar analytical techniques to each of them simultaneously. A good film relies on a well-considered, fleshed-out story, just as a good work of architecture relies on a strong central concept. This is what holds the work together. It's what gives it meaning. It provides a reason for every frame or every detail. There is a similarity between the story of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and the library concept, as they both, when they strip down to their very essence, are actually quite straightforward. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is an honest story about a few characters and their experiences over a relatively short period of time. The library is also quite a simple concept at heart. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a superb story about the city of LA as well as the film industry of the time. With this as the context, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood feels like it is about authentic storytelling, originality and uniqueness. The movie is set against the backdrop of the new film business of the 1960s and the arrival of the new breed of filmmaker like Coppola, De Palma and Scorsese, who are breaking down the old system. Movies were starting to change. Producers were becoming aware that they didn't understand the younger generation anymore.
So you're the man who killed the big movies, eh? You know they're referring to you as that now in the business?
Yeah, I know. There's a lot of people who don't like Dennis and me and Bert Schneider out there in California.
Yeah.
I think about 3,000 or 4,000 executives had to pack up and move out.
Should anyone not know, it's because of the gigantic success of Easy Rider.
Is
A
that
lot of
what it
big
was?
flips.
Oh.
Tarantino looked back at the movies he loved, what influenced him and what shaped him. He used the relationship between the actor and the stuntman as a way to humanize the film and the time, seen from their perspective. 1969 was an interesting and significant time, witnessing a culmination in the seismic shift in the creative art of filmmaking. As is synonymous with Tarantino's movies, the story is written by himself, and this story turns out to be an intimate one that follows the lives of Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth, and to a lesser extent that of Sharon Tate. It is probably Tarantino's most personal work, as he has written a movie that revolves around his two real passions, movie making and storytelling. Rem Koolhaas is a thinker. Rem's focus in the design of the library was, as with all his works, to produce an original, well-considered, functional civic piece of architecture. The Seattle Library tried to come to terms with books versus newer digital media. It also explores the concepts of flexibility, as well as the public versus private domains in a new digital environment. The initial brief was that the library's function was to support the physical word alone. Rem, however, knowing where things were heading, but unable to predict the future with certainty, created a building that would be prepared for the future, whilst not supporting the function of the traditional library alone. Rem was concerned with the spirit of architecture, not the form, but the substance. He looked at the function of the library as a container for the book, but also explored the book's new position that it has to share with other technologies and media. He also took one of the central conceptual drivers of the library to be its social function. It is interesting now that in 2020, this has become even more relevant. It is as if Rem was completely in tune with the social needs of the city, seeing beyond the brief and creating something more than the sum of its parts. Rem didn't want to create something boring, but he also didn't want to create something overly intellectual. Seattle is a beautiful but conventional, rational city. It is also a place where nature is ever present. So he took the very rational shapes of boxes in the library, stacked them, connected them vertically, and then shifted them off-center to orientate them to features of nature. The library was not envisaged to be a postmodern, flexible, multifunction building where anything can happen. The product of such an approach would produce architecture that all looked the same. Instead, the approach that Rem took resulted in an architecture that not only solved very specific compartmentalized program requirements, but also created an additional layered benefit through the careful arrangement of these compartments. Film relies on rhythm and pace to hold it together in a cohesive manner. The equivalent in architecture is a building's structure and its program. For film and architecture, they are reflected in the invisible, the underlying composition that, unless you're specifically looking for it, goes largely unnoticed. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood has a considered pace. The camera lingers, never in a rush. Every scene has a purpose, a rhythm, and a tempo of its own. For the Seattle Library, the rhythm is represented in the structural solution of the concrete frame as well as the facade. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood takes its time in scenes. The pace is what it needs to be. The camera lingers, exploring the scene. Although each scene has its own rhythm, there's also rhythm to the film as a whole. It is as if Tarantino is playing with us as we watch the movie, knowing that Tarantino has a specific style. You are expecting the violence. You are expecting the moments of madness. So he builds up scenes, but then lets them down quite gently, unexpectedly. You are left wondering, when am I going to get the Tarantino violence? But there is an ebb and a flow to the false tension builders that gives the whole movie its own rhythm. One of these is a 20-minute sequence that builds tension about midway in the movie, when Cliff walks all the way to the barn whilst Manson's crew wait outside. As he moves to the house, there is a feeling that they are moving with him. And as you move through the house, you expect to see George dead. But the tension is released when you see that he's still alive, and that Cliff is actually, and always has been, completely in charge of the situation. But it is these series of anticlimaxes that leaves the final scene that much more satisfying. You feel like you've earned a 5-minute release at the end of the movie, as if the other scenes were just foreplay. He had been building pressure for the entire movie. Because we know what could have been, or should have been, we feel that we are allowed to enjoy this brutal violence at the end. Another scene whose rhythm keeps you riveted is the shooting of the pilot of the Lancer movie. You follow Rick after he's had his meltdown and returns to the set to eventually nail the scene. that if only he was given the right material and opportunity, he could have been great. Rem took a very pragmatic approach to the design of the library. He created a building that naturally evolves by asking what the building wanted to be and following a hyper-rational process, and the building became a function of solving very empirical questions in an elegant way. Rem advocated the apparent contradictory phrase, compartmentalized flexibility. Each of the 5 compartment boxes were carefully designed to perform these specific functions optimally. One of the programmatic expressions was embodied in the book spiral contained in the biggest box. This allowed the whole Dewey Decimal System to be represented in one continuous run. This provided a clarity for the predominant function of the library, the cataloguing of books for ease of filing and finding. The structural solution has 2 distinct focuses. Firstly, the columns that carry the gravity loads. This rational grid was interrupted and modified by the introduction of sloping columns that carry some of the eccentric loads due to their unusual forms. And secondly, the 4 by 7 foot diamond grid and steel facade trusses that oppose the wind and seismic loads. Both systems work in unison to provide a complete integrated solution. The structural rhythm is manifested in the skin of the facade, which is also the giant bracing structure for the building that prevents it from tipping over. With 10,000 individual diamond-shaped panels, the lattice of steelwork is spliced together with visible connections, making the structure of the building itself legible. Just like the words in a book tell the story, so too do the connections tell the story of the structure. The narrative of a film is a connected series of events that carry the storyline. It is the components that make up the story. For architecture, it is represented in the form and the geometry. Each scene of the movie collectively contributes to the narrative, each one serving a specific purpose, but also finally contributing to the whole. Similarly, the form of the Seattle Library is a physical manifestation of the concept. The unique formal expression is the direct result of a clear conceptual basis for the design. The narrative in Tarantino's movie is contained in the structure and the sequence of the individual scenes. It is the arrangement of these scenes that give the movie its arc. The library has a similar macro structure and program, with a compartmentalization of functions that are arranged and connected to finally create form perceived as a unified whole. In the movie, the superbly constructed narrative relies on a series of sometimes disparate events that slowly craft the frame of reference for the characters, the city of LA, and the alternate future. Each scene is crafted with such care that it can be enjoyed in isolation or part of the larger narrative. The scenes individually are even identifiable and memorable. The scene where the world is introduced to the actress Julia Batters is probably one of the best. Here she insists on being referred to by her character name on set, as if she represents the new breed of serious actors that have embraced method acting. Here, with a mature head on her shoulders, she is implying that it is the pursuit that is meaningful, and if working extremely hard makes her performance even a little bit better, then she'll do it without hesitation. Their different books also refer to their perceptions of the world. Trudy is reading Walt Disney's biography, not for the child-friendly material that he produced, but for the recognition of his creative visionary genius. Rick's book, on the other hand, is about Tom Easy Breezy, a cowboy whose story mirrors Rick's own. There is another wonderful scene. Tarantino subtly introduces subtext that rewards those who are paying attention. Here we are introduced to the way Cliff clicks his teeth, and where we discover how Brandy the pit bull is able to show restraint before eating his food, and also how he can wait patiently before he pounces on the unsuspecting Mansons. In another interconnected narrative, we are shown how Rick has learned to use a flamethrower, so when he does eventually use it, we understand why we were taken through that in the previous narrative. Both the Brandy and the flamethrower scenes were introduced as almost anecdotes to the narrative, but like an inside joke, we understand the punchline much better because we have been taken along on their own personal journeys. Tarantino writes characters like no one else. Cliff is portrayed as the real superstar of the movie. The way he walks, changes an aerial, stands, everything he does is like you expect him to be the superstar. Cliff also represents this character who is quite easygoing and who can go with the flow. Whereas Rick, on the other hand, although the apparent star, is grappling with his own ability, with his mortality and his position. He is a flawed character, unlike Cliff, who knows exactly who he is and is perfectly comfortable in his own skin. We grow close to Rick and Cliff, so when they prevent what might have been, we feel they deserve to be the ones to correct history. Rem's formal architectural response was a direct result of its environment and the resolution of the library's function. The result was 5 separate boxes or compartments that housed specific functions. These individual discrete components were then assimilated into a larger body. It is the relationship in spaces between the parts and the whole where the flexibility is maintained. The boxes were not shifted arbitrarily, but rather responded to their connection to the environment. The living room faces the city, the reading room faces the water, and the book spiral floors face the mountains. The living room is a product of the manipulation of the form. This living room is an unprogrammed space where the people of Seattle can take ownership and do virtually anything. The book spiral is contained and protected in the middle of the building. But there is life and activity all around this central component. The public plaza also needed to be created to comply with the zoning code, so the form responded accordingly by setting back to provide this space at the ground level. The area between the boxes also spoke to the urban space of the city. It is in these interstitial spaces where the unpredictable future nature of the library can develop, and this is exactly what has happened. The living room on the 3rd floor has become the throbbing heart of the library, surrounded by places to work, interact, and play. The library is a light glass box, a polar opposite to dark traditional libraries. These still have their charm and their place, but this building offers another dimension to what libraries can be. The forms are placed pragmatically and then connected by a homogeneous skin, giving the building its iconic form. The uniformity of the facade glazing panels allows a building to appear as a singular mass. This form could be easily justified as a pure expression of empirically solving the building's functions. By doing this, it became easy for those to understand the form and its reason for being. Attention to every composition, every angle, every nut and bolt that tells the observer that every aspect has been considered, worked, and perfected with care. Truly successful works ensure that every detail and every frame carry the DNA of the whole. The detail in exceptional works of architecture are elegant, rational, and beautiful, just as every frame in a well-crafted film is compositionally balanced and color-graded for necessary emotional effect. Every detail of every scene in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was carefully considered to help tell the story. Color, shot detail, and composition all work together. Similarly, the library, although robust, has been very carefully detailed, with every aspect being given the care deserving of a public building of this importance. Details are important to this movie to give it its authenticity. Buildings, banners, signs, the cars, the radio stations, the clothes, every aspect transports you back into the 60s. In the color grading, they saturated the film to give richer skin tones that we don't actually see in movies these days. Current modern movies have moved to a very desaturated look. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, on the other hand, has a much warmer palette, with rich, alive colors. Tarantino went back to the detail of the time, the DJs that were playing, the songs that were appearing on the radio, as well as the adverts. Every car scene has a radio playing that keeps you in the time. All the sets were even practical. Tarantino was very proud of the fact that it was all real and that the actors could be in the moment. Bob Richardson was the cinematographer who worked to execute Tarantino's vision. Richardson used predominantly 35mm anamorphic, although he did use 70, 35 and even 16mm when required. Richard spoke of the texture of the film. He used specific Kodak stock that he selected based on its ability to segment colors, and along with this enhanced contrast that gave the film the feeling of the 60s. He also spoke of the way that it gave a grain and an organic look to the big screen that digital movies never could. They went to amazing lengths to recreate Hollywood in the 60s, including very specific costuming and location decisions. Here the interior of Rick's home tells a story about his life. He is immersed in his work. He doesn't have any art, he just has his work posters. Trailer, on the other hand, tells a story of what's important to him in his life, things beyond his work, his love for cars, his bikes, and his apparent love for Anne Francis. Real environments were created without relying on green screens or digital manipulation, and you end up getting shots like this. This authentic feel of the lighting would be very difficult to achieve with CGI. This is just a superb take of horse riding, just like an old western. It is as if Tarantino fell in love with the idea of showing the perfect horse ride sequence. The library is a robust structure. I would say that there is more of a focus on impact before a refinement of detail. There is an honesty to the expression of the structure. The materials are raw, the structure is exposed and legible. The connections are honest and not overclad to make the structure appear to be something it is not. To reduce the glare into essentially a big large glass box, the glass has a 2mm thick diamond mesh sandwiched between the two pieces of double glazing. This serves to cleverly shade the users of the building, but still appears completely transparent from the inside. Clear, color-coded circulation assists with designating lifts, stairs, and escalators. The lime green escalator slices through the building, and different colored carpets designate different areas with color and life. The Seattle Library won Library of the Year in 2020, 16 years after its completion. It demonstrates that REM had successfully rethought the nature of the library. REM embraced new possibilities and gave serious thought to the social aspect whilst allowing the library to adapt. It is exciting to see that the library has not stagnated, active and owned by the people of Seattle. There is a larger context that makes Once Upon a Time in Hollywood so significant, and try to prove that 35mm film is still a relevant medium, and that movies themselves are also still relevant. A younger generation appears to be less interested in sitting for 1.5 hours in a movie house. They seem to prefer to rather jump into and out of a series. I would argue that a Netflix series, or even worse YouTube, takes the control from the director and gives it to the short attention span of the viewer, allowing them to consume on TV, laptop or cell phone, or over a month, a week, or even a single sitting. This inevitably dilutes the experience when compared to a movie seen in a movie house that clearly leaves the control of the experience firmly in the hands of the director. This begs the question, is the large format, story-driven film intended to be viewed in the theatre actually a dying art? Instead, is the theatre reserved rather for the mega blockbuster action movie? If this is the case, then the true appreciation of films like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is destined to be lost. Like authentic filmmaking, layered, rich architecture is also at risk. Are developers and designers after the easily understood, the superficial building preoccupied with form-making and not so much with substance? Are clients also interested in creating the latest fad building that produces seductive iPhone imagery for an Instagram feed? Film and architecture need to also aspire to liberate the human condition, whether it be in the form of light, sound and time, or light, form and space.